She stood in the courtroom, gripping the table as the judge's words cut through the silence. The law is on Miss Freeman's side. The HOA's restrictions are invalid. Linda's smirk vanished. The room froze. Jessica had won. But what happened next shocked everyone. But let's start from the beginning. Jessica Freeman had always taken pride in her cozy home in a quiet suburb of Seattle. It was her first property, a symbol of independence and security. Every morning she admired the neatly trimmed lawn and the welcoming front porch, knowing she had worked hard to own this place. Then came the job opportunity, a 6-month relocation that she couldn't turn down. Renting out her home was the obvious choice. It would cover the mortgage, keep the house occupied, and let her return without financial strain. She had barely begun drafting the rental listing when the knock came. Linda Roberts, head of the HOA, stood on Jessica's doorstep, her expression cold and authoritative. She held a thick folder of printed regulations, gripping it like a weapon. "We don't allow rentals in this community," she stated flatly. Jessica frowned. "I don't recall seeing that in the HOA agreement when I bought the house." Linda pursed her lips. "Short term, long term, it doesn't matter. Rentals bring in outsiders. They lower property values. They change the neighborhood." Jessica's surprise turned into irritation. She had expected some minor bureaucratic hurdles, maybe a form to fill out, not an outright ban. "With all due respect, this is my home. I should be able to decide what to do with it." Linda's gaze didn't waver. "Rules exist for a reason." Jessica clenched her jaw. "And what happens if I go ahead and rent it anyway?" Linda let out a slow sigh, tilting her head. "That would be unfortunate. There are fines, penalties, even legal action if necessary." Jessica felt a chill crawl up her spine. This wasn't just a neighbor voicing concerns. This was a power move. The HOA was trying to control something that wasn't theirs to control. Jessica wasn't one to back down, but as she watched Linda's carefully measured smirk, she realized something unsettling. This fight wouldn't be easy. The first notice came just 2 days after Jessica's conversation with Linda. A formal letter from the HOA, tucked neatly into her mailbox, stating that her fence was in immediate need of repairs due to visible wear. Jessica inspected it closely. Nothing seemed wrong. The wood was intact, the paint barely faded. It was a manufactured issue, a pretext to apply pressure. Then came the second notice, citing non-compliance with the HOA's landscaping guidelines. The grass was a 1/4 inch taller than the supposed limit. The next day, a warning about trash bins being visible from the street. A week later, a letter reminding her, again, that rentals were strongly discouraged and that violations could result in fines. It wasn't just paperwork. The pressure felt calculated. Whenever Jessica stepped outside, she noticed Linda's car parked at the end of the street. Donald Pierce, another HOA board member, had started making unnecessary small talk whenever she walked to her car, slipping in passive-aggressive comments about keeping the neighborhood pristine. Margaret Lawson, who rarely even acknowledged Jessica before, suddenly became invested in pointing out community standards. Jessica felt suffocated in her own home. The very place that had once felt like her sanctuary now felt like a prison under surveillance. At night, she lay awake, replaying conversations, rereading notices, bracing for the next move. But she wasn't giving up. She dug into the HOA's regulations, rereading every clause. There was no explicit ban on long-term rentals. They had rules against short-term vacation rentals, but that wasn't her case. The more she read, the more she felt certain. They were bluffing. Still, the stress was unrelenting. Every new letter, every veiled threat sent a fresh jolt of frustration through her. But underneath the exhaustion, something stronger started to form, a defiance she couldn't ignore. If they wanted a fight, she would give them one. Jessica's nights blurred into a cycle of endless reading and note-taking. Property law, HOA bylaws, state statutes. She consumed it all like a woman on a mission. Every legal forum she could find, every discussion thread about homeowners fighting back, every case study. She dissected them, searching for anything that could turn the tide. She reached out to an old college friend, Mark, now a junior attorney at a local firm. HOAs love to overreach, he told her over the phone. They bank on homeowners not knowing their rights, but if they're making up rules, there's a way to shut them down. That was all Jessica needed to hear. She doubled down, highlighting every loophole, every contradiction in the HOA's policies. Then, finally, she found it. A state statute, buried in legal jargon, but crystal clear in its meaning. HOAs could not ban long-term rentals as long as the property met community standards. Jessica felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it, the leverage she needed. She crafted a letter so airtight even the most stubborn board member couldn't poke holes in it. She cited the statute, outlined her compliance with HOA guidelines, and demanded that they immediately acknowledge her right to rent out her home. The next morning, she hand-delivered copies to Linda, Donald, and Margaret, watching their reactions with quiet satisfaction. Linda barely skimmed the document before scoffing. "This law doesn't apply here," she said dismissively. Donald nodded in agreement. "You're misinterpreting it." But Jessica wasn't the same woman they had tried to intimidate weeks ago. She stood her ground. "Then take it up with the court," she said, voice steady, "because that's where we're headed." And just like that, she filed a formal complaint with the county court. The moment she hit submit on the legal filing, a strange calm settled over her. The fight wasn't over, but now it was on her terms. The judge's voice cut through the tense silence like a blade. "The law is on Miss Freeman's side. The HOA's restrictions are invalid." For a moment, no one moved. The courtroom, which had been filled with the murmurs and quiet confidence of the HOA board, now felt suffocatingly still. Jessica's eyes locked onto Linda, who sat rigid in her chair, jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Donald and Margaret exchanged uneasy glances, the smug certainty they had carried into the courtroom evaporating in real time. They had walked in expecting an easy win, expecting Jessica to fold under pressure. Instead, they had just been legally shut down in front of everyone. Jessica's attorney, a composed and sharp-witted woman named Rachel, leaned in slightly toward the judge. "Your Honor, we request that the court order the HOA to cease all retaliatory actions against my client and immediately recognize her right to rent her property per state law." The judge nodded. "So ordered." It was over. Jessica felt the weight of weeks, months of stress lifting off her chest. She had won. Not through intimidation, not by bending to the HOA's endless harassment, but by standing her ground, by refusing to be bullied out of her own rights. As she stepped out of the courtroom, the reality of what had just happened hit her. She had taken on the system and won. News spread fast. That same afternoon, neighbors who had barely spoken to her before began reaching out. Some stopped by her house, some sent messages. One older couple, the Petersons, admitted they had wanted to rent out their home years ago, but had backed down when Linda and her cronies threatened them with legal action. "I wish we had fought back like you," Mrs. Peterson said, shaking Jessica's hand. Others whispered about their own run-ins with the HOA, the arbitrary fines, the intimidation tactics, the feeling of powerlessness. But now, that fear was gone. Jessica's fight hadn't just been about her home. It had set a precedent. The HOA was no longer an untouchable force. They had been challenged, exposed, and defeated, and the neighborhood would never be the same again.